So in this little video, we're going to talk about color correction. There's a whole bunch of different things that we can use to create color correction inside of our videos. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure my layout is how I like it. Because I am going to be doing some editing to this video, I can choose the editing tab. But because I know I'm doing color correction, I'm actually going to switch to the color section. Just like that. And the main color correction tool that you're going to use for pretty much any video is going to be this Lumetri color. Now, if I do switch back to my editing tab and come over here to my effects panel, I can type in any of the color correction types that I used inside of Photoshop or After Effects. So things like levels, brightness and contrast, the HLS color balance, which is hue, lightness, saturation, curves, or this Lumetri color. I am a personal fan of going straight into Lumetri because it is super customizable. Here we have our Lumetri Scopes histogram. This will show us all the high and low points and peaks of our color. So with this cowboy here, depending on how we color correct our footage, will change the overall feel of our clip. So take this cowboy. If I were to make this entire clip a little bit darker, it would give it a more somber or overall more gritty feel. If I were to take this lighter, it'll give you a lot more kind of happy and light feel. This smile that this guy gives here changes drastically based off of the color correction. Now this is a very simple light to dark kind of play here, but it would work throughout the entire clip. So let's take a look at a couple of different things that you can do within Lumetri Color. So you have a couple of different sections. You've got basic correction, creative, curves, color wheels, HLS or HSL secondary, and vignettes. So most of the basic color correction you're going to do is in this basic correction. Our input here is a preset, so if we wanted to change to a different preset, we could just automatically do so. I'm not going to. We could also come in here and change our white balance. You can use the little eyedropper, find the brightest part of your image, and it'll automatically try to correct for it. Or you can come in here and manually change all of the different inputs from your shadows, whites, blacks, and highlights, as well as your exposure and contrast. Now this temperature and tint will help you remove some of that bright orangish kind of color by taking it into the blue, or vice versa, you can remove some of that blue and take it closer to the orange. Depending on how this slider moves will give you more of a cool tone or a warm tone, and somewhere in the middle will give you a nice balance of the two. Now, if your footage that you record is super duper orange, you can push that temperature closer to the blue and it'll kind of negate it a little bit. It does have a limit, so you know, if your footage is like the orangest of the orange, probably don't use that piece. We also have our tint. This works in about the same way. I'm going to put this back down to 0, where we can take this toward the green to add a bit more green tone, or toward the magenta to add more magenta. This will also color correct any different color changes that you might have that maybe it's too green or a little bit too pink. I'm going to take that also back to 0. So I'm going to take my temperature down just a little bit closer to blue, make it a little cooler. You can change your exposure, make it brighter or darker. I'm going to brighten it just a little bit. You can up your contrast or lighten your contrast to get a little bit less overall saturated black or dark values through the hair, get a little bit more detail in there. Same with your highlights, you can up those or lower those as needed. Same with your shadows, make your shadows darker or lighter, your white brighter or darker, and your black brighter or darker, as you wish. There's also a reset in case you're just like, ugh, I don't like what I did. There is an auto, which will automatically take values and try to get your footage to be as nice as possible. Sometimes that works really well, so like here on his skin, you can see that worked very well. But over in his hair, we get this kind of dark, crunchy values. So you could go in with a mask and do a slightly different value there, or you could just play around with these. So if I know that that black right here is probably what's causing the problem, I can take that up a little bit, and it automatically will fix it a little bit. And then there's a saturation here. Remember, saturation just adds more color to the already existing color values, unlike vibrancy, which enhances color. So I am a personal fan of not touching this personal saturation. There are so many different saturation buttons inside of Lumetri Color. If you just throw one in each section, they do stack. So the more saturations you add, the more saturation will be added to your clip. So I'm going to leave this saturation just at 100. Next is creative. We can add looks, which is pretty much a different type of filter. There is also a plugin that's for looks. If it works for your computer, then you have the plugin. If it doesn't, you get a big X across your computer, or at least across your video, then it just means you don't have that plugin. But it works pretty much like filters. And this intensity, so I'll just pick this one here, is how much or how less this filter is being applied. So I'm just going to take this back to none. Next, you can add faded film, give it a little bit more of a kind of old school style vibe. You can sharpen it if you're just a little bit fuzzy. I don't recommend sharpening all the way because you'll get some really kind of odd little artifacting depending on your clips. Vibrance, again, just kind of enhances color. So you can see we're not adding too much. It's still getting a little bit too much overall, but we're not adding new color. Whereas if I were to take the saturation all the way up, you can tell we're adding to the colors. We also have some shadowing tint and highlight tint. So if you want to take your color to a different tone and you're like, I want all my shadows to be more blue, I want all my highlights to be more red, you can do that. So you can see the darker parts are bluer, the brighter parts are more red. This curves section is just like the curves that are in Photoshop and in After Effects. So depending on how I change this overall curve, I will get different results across my image. So if I pull something that kind of looks like this weird kind of U shape, all of my darks got darker, all of my brights up here are brighter, and all of my middle tones are also brighter. I can take that into the lower side. You can see I get some kind of weird results. Trying to really push that color correction. So depending on how your curve looks will change how your overall footage is being edited. We also have red, green, and blue channels here, but we also have hue and saturation, hue and hue, hue and luma, which is your overall lumosity, your luma versus saturation, and your saturation versus saturation. All of these are different color correction things that you can do that will all give you different results on how your color works across your footage. Then we have color wheels and matching. This is also a really good way to add specific colors and remove specific colors from your footage. So for instance, there's a lot of kind of yellowish green tones in here. If I want to take them just a little bit more toward the blue, you can see all of my shadows are now a little bit more blue. If I wanted to take my mid-tones a little bit more purple, you can see all these mid-tones start to get a little bit more purple. And if I take all my highlights toward this green, you can see all of my brighter spots go a little bit more green. You can really get in here and very easily manipulate your coloring. Next is another hue, saturation, and lightness section. This is a little bit more in-depth saturation changing. So this is where you could do that kaleidoscope of color. You can include multiple different values in your color. Let's see if it will let me slide it. There we go. So you can see my colors are changing a little bit. We can also come down here and change more of the temperature and tint, contrast, sharpen, and overall saturation. And then we have our vignette. Do we want one? Do we not want one? Or dark or light vignette? Where do we want the midpoint of that vignette to be? How round do we want it? Do we want it to be boxy or super duper round? And how much do we want it to feather? And that is your basic color correction.